I'm Dr. Chad Hansen. I'm a forest and fire biologist with the John Muir Project. I'm just noticing that's our old address, so our new address, current address is on our website. The rest of the information behind me is accurate. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit today about a dominant narrative, a very common narrative that is basically governing the conversation about forests and fire. And what we should do and how we should manage it, where we should focus our resources and our attention. And that's basically the narrative that the denser forests, in other words, more carbon-rich forests that haven't burned in a long time, that they will burn much more intensely. And that's first of all, that's a bad thing, but also just that they will burn more intensely. And so if we want to have lower intensity fires, we have to remove a bunch of trees and a bunch of carbon from the forest. That's the narrative out there. So I want to talk about that a little bit because I see it as a dangerous narrative because it's diverting and focusing resources out into the forest wildlands. Oftentimes these giant logging projects are implemented increasingly under the rubric of community protection, based on this notion that somehow if we remove millions of trees from the forest, it's going to stop the fires from reaching the towns. It'll protect the towns. And that's diverting resources away, it's diverting attention away, it's giving communities a certain sense of security that I argue is false. It's also pitting climate change mitigation imperatives against biodiversity conservation, which I think is dangerous. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit because that's the bad news. The good news is that there's a whole lot of science that tells us that despite the fact that these things make intuitive sense, that if the forest is denser, it's going to burn more intensely. If it hasn't burned in a long time, it'll burn more intensely. The science is telling us, the overwhelming majority of the science is telling us the opposite, that actually denser forests tend to burn at lower intensity. So I'll talk a little bit about why that is. But I can only, of course, cover just a little bit of the science in this short presentation. We have a lot more about this on our website, John Muir Project website. And I'm always happy to follow up with folks by email or phone to talk more about it. All right, so this is research by Zoll and Dunn. It looks specifically at this issue of whether forests with higher biomass burn more intensely, and this is increasing biomass, and that line up there is fire severity, basically a function of tree mortality. Fire severity going down as biomass goes up. So why is that? How can that be? Because what we hear is, if you have a denser forest, you have a lot more fuel. And if there's more fuel, of course, it's going to burn more intensely. Well, on the one hand, that's true. On the surface, you have more biomass. You have more things that theoretically or ostensibly could burn. But what you also have are countervailing factors. You have more canopy cover. You have more cooling shade from that canopy cover. You have more moisture retention. You have higher relative humidity because of that higher canopy cover, because of the additional shade. Because you have so much canopy cover, you have less combustible vegetation in the understory, fewer grasses because they need a lot of sunlight, for example. Everything stays more moist on the forest floor, even in the middle of summer. And because you have a denser forest, you also have more of a windbreak against the winds that drive the flames. And that wind buffer, that wind resistance that the denser stand provides is actually a key factor. And we find the same thing looking at that same question from a slightly different perspective. If a forest hasn't burned in a very, very long time, typically it's going to be much denser. So, different researchers have looked at this question too. TSF means time since fire. So this bar here, this is areas that haven't burned in over 75 years. And then when they burn, that black bar is high severity. This is moderate and that's low. And what you see there is that in the forests that had not burned in the longest period of time, they did not have higher levels of high severity. They actually had lower levels of high severity. I was not a co-author of this study, but I've researched this on my own, and we just didn't find any difference. We didn't find lower levels of high severity, we just didn't find any difference at all. So that wasn't really the issue. That's not to say that previous fire doesn't influence subsequent fire. It absolutely does. There's a lot of research on that. But it's typically in a very short period of time after the last fire. It could be a few years, it could be several years, it could be a little bit longer, but it's not indefinite. And the assumption was, if a previous fire influences fire intensity, fire severity for a few years, then 10 years later, it'll be even bigger. 20 years later, there'll be even more fuel accumulation, even more intensity. 50 years later, et cetera. And it doesn't work that way. It's not a linear increase. And a big part of this, of course, is that the entire conversation is misplaced and misdirected. This is not fundamentally a forest density issue. This is a weather and climate change issue. That is the fundamental thing that drives fires. If you have a drought year and you have hot, dry, windy conditions and you have an ignition, guess what? You're going to have a larger, fast-moving fire that is not going to be suppressible. That's a fact. This is a climate issue, fundamentally. Now, that's not to say that forest density is totally irrelevant. It's not. It is a secondary factor, but the interesting thing is it's a secondary factor in the opposite direction from what most people assume. Denser, more carbon-rich. You have a microclimate that is actually functioning as a climate buffer against the extreme weather driven by climate change in a fire. And I'll mention here, I was a co-author of this study. This is the largest scientific analysis ever done on this question in North America. We analyzed 1,500 fires over 3 decades. And the question we looked at was one that was posed by politicians again and again, but they hadn't gathered the data. And they said, well, if you have forests with higher levels of environmental protection, that means you have a lot less management. And if you have a lot less management, that means you have denser forests because you're not pulling all those trees out of the forest. So they're going to burn much more severely. And so they were proposing to roll back environmental laws and pass large sweeping bills that would increase logging on federal lands under the guise of fire management. They hadn't done the math on it. We looked at the question, and what we found is that forests with the highest levels of protection and no logging actually had the lowest levels of fire severity. And forests with the fewest environmental protections and the most tree removal had the highest levels of fire severity. And that's after controlling for forest types. So this was all in the same forest types. Contrary to popular wisdom, but this is what we found. And again, it doesn't make sense initially to a lot of folks, but it does once you think about it a little bit more deeply in terms of the microclimate effects. A lot of the modeling work out there, I don't tend to rely on modeling studies. I tend to rely on an actual studies that deal with real fires in real forests. But it's important to note that even a lot of the modeling studies out there are finding that when you remove trees from forests, in more cases than not, it actually increases fire severity. And that really doesn't even get talked about in a lot of the environmental assessments and environmental impact statements that the Forest Service, for example, is turning out. And even a lot of the folks, the scientists who are really promoting thinning and promoting this idea that the forests are too dense, they're overgrown, and we need to remove vast amounts of carbon from the forest to restore them and to curb fires. Even a lot of those folks are actually finding in their results things that are contrary to what they're saying when they're quoted in the press. This is Stevens et al. 2021. Dr. Stevens is one of the primary proponents of thinning, but he found that as thinning occurred, surface fire rate of spread increased. In other words, it goes to what I was saying earlier, that if you have a less dense forest, you have less wind resistance, and the flames will sweep through the fire, the air of the forest faster than a denser forest. And what that means, of course, is that fires will reach a town, a vulnerable community, more quickly. If a fire is moving faster, that means there's less time to evacuate. And there's less time for first responders to get to the community and help people evacuate. Not everyone can evacuate easily on their own. Some folks need some help. And there's less time to make that a safe process, less time for first responders to do last minute defensible space work and structured defense. And that has tragic consequences. And so I'm going to talk about that a little bit too. But first, this is a study I did in 2021. This is the Creek Fire, a big fire that occurred in 2020 in the southern Sierra Nevada. I looked at this question from a different perspective. I looked at different management categories, post-fire logging that was done under the rubric of fuel reduction, supposedly to reduce future fire severity. I looked at private forest lands where they had done 40 years of thinning and burning. I looked at commercial thinning, and I looked at just general forest lands with no management. Basically what I found was that the areas where logging had occurred, whether it was thinning, commercial thinning, or post-fire logging, they actually had the highest levels of fire severity, not the lowest. And this was a very large fire, so very large analysis covering a large landscape, 380,000 acre fire. And this is a pretty typical example of what most of the really dense forest burned like in this fire. This is the creek fire. This burned at just a low intensity surface fire. You can't even tell that the forest burned. But this was a surface fire area, and this is what most of the really dense forest, this is how most of the dense forest in the creek fire burned. Another example here, you see a little bit of tree mortality in the kind of really very small understory size classes, but again, very creepy surface fire, and this is pretty typical. Now, that's not to say that none of the dense forest burned at high intensity. Of course they did, when the weather dictated that result. But all things being equal, they tended to burn a little bit lower. Now, on the opposite side of the scale, in the areas that have been commercially thinned, based on this notion that removing most of the trees will create open stands, it will prevent crown fire because it's removing the ladder fuels that will otherwise climb into the canopy. I'm here to tell you that that notion is not well-founded. It doesn't really work that way. The crown fire can and will operate when there's almost no ladder fuels. This area had been heavily thinned, and of course in that main middle open area, there really weren't any trees supposedly to carry the flames into the crown. But the flames go from the ground up, and they don't really need the small trees to get higher. They need the weather to be right. Dry conditions, hot conditions, and enough of the fine material on the surface of the forest floor to carry flames and create that combustion. Small twigs, pine needles, dry leaves, etc. This is an area that is even more open. And again, both of these areas were heavily thinned based on the idea that it would prevent the potential for crown fire. Crown fire is not possible in an area that's this open and low density. But of course, many of the areas that they logged this way did burn at crown fire. And these are not unusual or exceptional examples. This is actually fairly common. And again, this is not to say that a thinned area can't burn at low intensity. That happens all the time too, when the weather is right and when the weather dictates that. And this is a vast area of private lands. This is Southern California Edison forest lands, and they had been thinning and burning in this forest for 40 years. And that's where one of the largest high-intensity fire patches in the creek fire occurred. And again, it's not because they were thinning and burning that the crown fire occurred. It's because that's what the weather and climate conditions on that day at that moment dictated. In other words, that wasn't really the issue. It's about weather and climate. And this is an area on Forest Service land just across over the ridge that they had heavily post-fire logged years earlier in an earlier fire, and they said that all the removal of the dead trees, that would prevent a future high-intensity fire. And many of those areas that they post-fire logged burned extremely intensely later when the creek fire burned. So it did not prevent high-intensity fire. The other thing that the Forest Service leaves out of this conversation, and this is a really important one, is what we call cumulative severity. We also call it cumulative mortality. There are a lot of studies, and this is what confuses a lot of people. They say, well, look, I know there's a bunch of studies by the Forest Service going back 20, 25 years that say that thinning effectively reduces fire severity, and draw that conclusion. You're absolutely right, that there are those studies. The problem is that most of those studies are theoretical modeling studies. They don't use actual fires. And the ones that actually do pertain to actual fires do not account for the tree mortality from thinning itself. And this is a pretty big factor, okay? It's a massive source of bias. If they were only reducing 5% or 10% of the trees, that might be a different thing. But a lot of these thinning projects, as a lot of folks in this room know, if you walk the ground in these areas, we're not talking about 5 or 10%. We're talking about 30 or 40% on the low end, and oftentimes 50, 60, 70%. Increasingly, I'm seeing thinning projects where they're killing and removing 80, 90% of the trees in the stand. Okay, and then the fire comes through, and they ignore the 80 or 90 or 70% of the trees they killed before the fire, and they only focus on what was left after. And so if you have slightly fewer of the trees that remain after thinning that were killed by the fire, they say, oh, well, thinning was effective. right? So, that's again a massive source of bias. And this is true of all of the studies that have been produced by the Forest Service over the last 25 years. They do not account for tree mortality from thinning. So that is a problem. What we found is that when you account for it, that the overall tree mortality from thinning plus fire is much higher than tree mortality from fire itself. It's a pretty big deal. So this is not an effective way to go. And from a community protection standpoint, what it all means is these fires are reaching these communities, oftentimes reaching them faster than they otherwise would because of the tree removal, and they're burning down towns and oftentimes killing a lot of people. And that is a tragedy that is preventable because we do not have to focus our resources on giant logging projects out in the forest, telling communities it's somehow going to save them from fire. The community of Grizzly Flats was told explicitly by the Forest Service that this giant thinning project far from the town would stop a fire from ever reaching the town. That was a direct communication to the community. People didn't do the defensible space pruning around their homes. They didn't do the home hardening. They didn't put ember-proof vents on their homes. They didn't get the dry pine needles and leaves off their roofs. They thought they were covered because the Forest Service told them, you don't have to worry about it. The Caldor fire came from the south of Grizzly Flats. It blew through those thin areas at mostly high intensity, and it burned down the town. Grizzly Flats is gone. That did not have to happen. And this is Grizzly Flats here. That's where the fire started. And these are the thin areas. There are a lot of other types of logging, so I haven't shown those. Clear cuts and various types of logging that wouldn't be characterized as thinning, and those burned at high intensity too. But the point is that these areas did not act as fuel breaks. They did not stop the fire from reaching the town. Same thing in the Caldor fire on the eastern side, where we saw the fire burning right through these thinned areas. You can see the green and purple polygons. They didn't stop the fire. But where the fire did actually stop is at defensible space areas right next to homes. Here and here. And these were areas, there was no logging, it was just pruning. They removed seedlings, saplings, they removed some lower limbs within 100, 200 feet of the homes or the private property boundary. And that actually did make a difference, especially with the water drops right next to the community. And this is the campfire in 2018. Fire started 15, 16 miles east of the community of Paradise. It burned through some of the most heavily logged forest in the entire northern Sierra Nevada, some of the most heavily logged forest in the western United States. Massive areas of thinning, green tree removal, massive areas of post-fire logging, removing dead trees, all under the rubric of the guise of community protection, fuel reduction to prevent the fire from reaching the community. The fire spread through that logged area in about 5 hours. That's the fastest and most intense that the fire burned in the entire 151,000 acre fire by far. That's what burned through fastest. It burned down 14,000 homes and killed 86 people. This again was preventable. This did not have to happen. And it's not that the fire would not have reached the community if it hadn't been for all the logging. It would have, because that's what the wind was doing, that's what the weather was doing. It was driving the fire to the west and the southwest, and it was hot, dry, and windy, and the fire was going to get there. It wouldn't have got there as fast, but it was going to get there. But what wouldn't have happened if we had focused on community safety, and if the resources had been provided and the assistance to the community. Some people wouldn't have taken it, but others would have. A lot of those homes most of those homes would not have burned. The home hardening, the defensible space pruning, the evacuation planning and assistance, that would have happened. Instead of the community thinking, we don't have to worry about it because the fire's not going to get here, because the Forest Service and the logging company told us that that giant logging project out there miles away over the ridge is going to stop the fire from getting here. That was a dangerous lie. And these are just a few examples. There are many, many other examples of this, but one of the ones I want to talk about briefly before I turn it over to my co-panelists is the recent fires in Los Angeles. Now, Congress, in its infinite wisdom, just passed, the House of Representatives just passed the so-called Fix Our Forests Act, Fix Our Forests Act, for those of you who haven't heard of it, is a logging bill in disguise that would roll back environmental laws and increase logging massively on federal lands across the nation, supposedly, among other things, to protect communities from fire. Now, the reality is that most of the communities that are at greatest risk from wildfire are nowhere near a forest. They are in grasslands, they're in oak woodlands, they're in the chaparral habitat, but they're not in a forest. And so not only are the communities that are in forests not being protected by this approach of logging out in the wildlands and telling people it's going to stop the fire from reaching them, but most of the communities that are at greatest risk are not even in forests. So I'm going to talk about this. Okay, sorry, this is the Dixie Fire. This is another example before I get to the LA fires. This is a huge area of thinning before the fire. You can see the thinning here. This area was all thinned, and this is actually kind of like on the lower end of thinning intensity. And this is how it burned. It burned at almost 100% crown fire. Just north of this image is the community of Canyon Dam, which was destroyed. Canyon Dam, that town is gone now. Again, this was done telling the town it would save them from fire. And this is what used to be Altadena, a town that I know very, very well in the Los Angeles area. These areas were 3.5 miles from the national forest boundary. And even on the national forest, it's not forest until you go about 5 miles further into the mountains and climb about 4,000 feet. Then you start getting up into some conifers. But like the fire burned through chaparral entirely. And these homes and the businesses, they burned from a massive ember rain. None of these ever came in contact with the fire. These burned from ignitions from embers and extreme winds, 100-mile-an-hour gusts, and 5% relative humidity. So again, if we want to walk the talk, we care about protecting communities from fire. This is not a forest management issue. This is a community protection issue. And we have to focus entirely a different way from the home out. Now I'll talk briefly before I sign off here about a trio of articles produced by some Forest Service scientists, Pritchard et al., Hagman et al., and Hesberg et al. This was in 2021 in a single issue of a particular scientific journal. My colleagues and I in De La Sala et al. 2022, we addressed these three articles. And we found that they falsely claimed that the science was settled. That's what they claimed. We don't need to talk about this anymore. Thinning works. Let's do a lot more thinning. It will stop the fires. It will protect the communities. What we found is that even in their study, they had to admit over and over and over again the contrary conclusion to what they were promoting. They had to admit that thinning causes higher surface fuel loads. It can contribute to high-intensity surface fire, elevated levels of tree mortality, elevated fire intensities. Thinning can increase surface wind speed and fuel heating, which increases the rate of fire spread in thin forests. It can increase the risk of fire by increasing sunlight exposure to the forest floor, drying vegetation, increasing wind speeds. The things I was talking about earlier in terms of the microclimate effects, they had to admit this over and over and over again, and then inexplicably at the end they say the science is settled and thinning is highly effective and stop talking about anything to the contrary. I call that an example of bias. But we looked into, in De La Sala et al. 2022, we looked into even the studies they cited for the proposition that thinning is highly effective. And the studies didn't say what they claimed. One found that thin forests had mostly higher intensity fire. Another one, the conclusion said thinning is effective, but if you looked at the results, it showed the opposite, that the reburn of the previous wildfires had the lower fire intensity, whereas the thin forests actually had higher intensity. And then the other one, Joachim Kent, found that thin forests had fewer live trees and less carbon than areas that just burned in the wildfires. So this was not actually supporting their argument, and yet these were cited as evidence of support. So we did a very, very large analysis of the entire body of studies that they had cited for the proposition that historical forests were much less dense, much more open. And what we found is that they had omitted vast bodies of scientific evidence to form that conclusion. And that when all that omitted evidence was included, the conclusion was historical forests were far denser than they had claimed. Now, that's not to say there weren't open forests. Those were there too, but there was a real mix of open and dense forests. It wasn't all just open forests. And we found that they had actually falsified the scientific record. Last thing I'll cover is just the notion that if you have forests with more dead trees, they're always going to burn more intensely. There's a lot of science on this too. The largest and most comprehensive studies are either finding no effect of higher densities of dead trees, or they're finding that forests with more dead trees tend to burn at lower intensities. That's what this research finds. Now again, that may seem counterintuitive. People say, no, that can't be right, but then they've done their own studies and they tend to find the same thing. Now, I have my own theories about why that is. I think it has to do with microclimate effects there too. Dead trees fall, down logs soak up and store 25 times more water per cubic foot than the surrounding soil. They act like giant sponges more than anything else, in addition to providing habitat and cycling nutrients. So I will stop it there because I know there's limited time, but I'm happy to answer questions afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Chad. That was amazing. Hello, everybody. My name is Paula Hood. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm co-director of Blue Mountains Biodiversity Project. And Blue Mountains Biodiversity Project works to protect and restore Eastern Oregon Cascades and the Blue Mountains in Eastern Oregon and Southeastern Washington. And field surveying is the heart of the work that we do. We're in the field from the beginning of June through September every year. And our staff and volunteers spend thousands of hours every field season surveying proposed timber sales. And I've been with BMVP for almost 10 years and engaged in similar work for a little over 20 years. And I have an academic background in environmental science. And so I wanted to highlight our field survey perspective on some of these issues. So, and focusing in on Eastern Oregon and East Side Forest because that's where we work. So a lot of people don't think too much about East Side forests. Some of you do, a lot of you don't. And most people aren't aware that actually east of the Cascades in Oregon, there are the east side of the state encompasses half of the forests in the state. So really a lot of the forests are actually on the east side of the Cascade Crest and deserve a lot more attention than they usually get. I also want to point out that not all the forests on the east side are dry ponderosa pine forests, which you hear a lot, and it's part of the wildfire narrative of needing ostensibly, supposedly, to log these forests. But anyway, so a lot of these forests can be downright lush. This is actually a picture from the Malheur National Forest near the Middle Fork of the John Day River. And really there's just this amazing array of like a complex mosaic of forest types on the east side. So you get everything from sagebrush, juniper, dry open ponderosa pine, very, very moist mixed conifer forests, and sometimes all within a really short distance from each other. So it's pretty cool out there. If you don't spend a lot of time, I suggest checking it out. Our field work tends to focus on timber sales before they have been logged, and we use the information that we collect on the ground to fight for those forests. But we've also started increasingly looking a little bit more at forests that have recently been logged. We still focus mostly on proposed timber sales, but we've started to do a little bit more post-logging work. And so I want to give a few examples. So this is the Lex timber sale in Deschutes National Forest. There's Mount Bachelor. You know, all of these sales that we field survey have been characterized by the Forest Service and timber industry and the collaboratives as not as logging, but as fuels reduction and fuels management or restoration. And what we're finding, unfortunately, all too often, is that this is very different from from what we find on the ground in the field. And so in addition to the key issues that Chad discussed, that thinning to address wildfire is an ineffective and outdated strategy, a false solution. So those are very crucial discussion issues and points. And in addition to that, we're finding frequently that there is this huge discrepancy between what even the Forest Service is calling thinning and what the reality looks like when we get out there and look at the post-logging practices. And so this is Lex timber sale, there's no bachelor. The description of this was to treat roughly 6,500 acres to to restore historic species composition, structure, and process. This is the Forest Service quote. Treatments would include fuels reduction and prescribed burning, so then, that fuels piece. Here's a couple pictures from the ground view of that timber sale. And then that timber sale, as is often the case, is near another big timber sale. So just south of the Lex project, which is at the north, Lex timber sale, there's the Junction timber sale. And this was actually the first timber sale I commented on when I joined the MVP on staff. And so this one was described as reducing hazardous fuels to protect values at risk to from wildfire, and that included values such as scenic corridors and wildlife habitats. And the Forest Service described it as reducing stalking in ponderosa pine stands to increase vigor and resilience to insects, disease, and wildfire. And I want to take just a minute and note a few of the many euphemisms used for logging. So I've been doing this work for over 20 years now, and while logging itself, logging on the ground, has largely remained the same, the Forest Service's framing of that logging continues to evolve and is increasingly greenwashed. And so here are some examples: fuels reduction, fuels management, resiliency, vegetation management, integrated vegetation management, somebody who's feeling very clever, restoration, fire, insects, disease management, community safety, etc. Here are, here's another example. So here's recent logging in the South George Vegetation Management Project, and this was ostensibly to improve vigor, health, and fire resistance within a forested ecosystem. This is recent logging in the Walton Lake sale in the Ochiko National Forest, and this was also billed as a restoration project. And while this actually focused a little more on ostensibly addressing disease, they've also had a fuels reduction component. So the rationales for logging have changed over the years, and that's true even while logging and the problems caused by logging have remained largely the same. And it has also remained a consistent theme that the Forest Service claims that the very problems caused by logging will somehow be fixed by more logging. And so nowadays, the main greenwashing on the east side is that it's framed as a solution to wildfire, and logging is sold to the public as necessary to protect communities from wildfire, even when it's done, as Chad was discussing, far in the backcountry, very far away from communities. Similarly to what you said, there's also, most of the structures in the western US are lost to grass fires, not forest fires. But who doesn't like a good restoration project? Right? Especially when it's built by the agency as keeping the public safe from wildfire. And often thinning and fuels reduction are understood by much of the public to be just cutting a few trees, understory trees. And the agency promotes this understanding because they know that most of the public is not actually on board with logging of old growth trees or virtual clear cutting or other heavy industrial logging practices. And so this is the Big Mosquito Project, which I want to talk about for just a second. And this was heavily promoted by the agency and by the collaborative group on the Malheur National Forest and timber industry as restoration needed to protect old growth ponderosa pine trees. And so some of that description from the agency included things like a suite of activities to restore forest resiliency, and including fuels treatments. One of the main reasons put forth for the sale was to reduce fuel loading by reducing the density of standing vegetation, surface fuels, and/or ladder fuels. This is actually a picture of from the Forest Service itself in the NEPA documents. So this was what they were showing the public during the public comment process, what the public could expect forests would look like after a different euphemism, free selection thinning. That was kind of a unique one. So this was supposedly what it would look like after logging was done. And so I got curious because this was really touted as pushed as a successful restoration project for logging to save old ponderosa pines. And so we had actually field surveyed this sale before it was logged. And so here on the left side is one of our volunteers, Brenna, in the sale pre-logging. And then this side is actually that same unit, that same slope, but just viewed from the different direction after logging. And so this is, and this was actually the first place that I found when I got out of the truck. Like, we got out of the truck looking for trees for logging, and we were just like, oh my God. So anyway, yeah, this does not strike me as thinning. And so we also found lots and lots of old growth ponderosa pines cut down, unfortunately. And so we had time to document about 30. There were many more, and this was just one sale unit in several thousands of acres of timber sale. Also this free selection thinning with skyline logging. This particular unit was about 80 acres. They still had about 720 more acres to go of this logging that hadn't started when we were field surveying. So we're very concerned that more of this is going to happen. But of the ones, the old growth ponderosa pines that we found cut down, about a third of them were over 200 years old, and most of them were over 150, which is how the Forest Service defines old growth. So some were over 200, and some were over 300. And so, we're really, and I should note that these old growth ponderosa pine trees were technically not targeted for logging, but they were part of logging implementation. And so specifically in this, they were cable corridors. We met with the Forest Service in the field to discuss our concerns. They stood by this as restoration, and they also confirmed that these trees were taken to the mill and sold, even though they weren't officially targeted for logging. And then, this is not also an isolated incident. Here's next door in the Camp Lick timber sale. This was also considered commercial thinning. This is a stand improvement, another euphemism, commercial thinning from the Camp Lick sale. And that and this is another stand improvement commercial thinning unit from the Camp Lick sale. There was also lots of old growth ponderosa pine trees that we documented cut down as part of logging implementation, even though they weren't specifically officially targeted, but there they were, cut down and sold. So that was extremely concerning to us. The Camp Lick sale also had some biomass logging as a part of it, incidentally. Here are some more examples of sales that had wild, like fuels reduction, community safety, restoration rationales for them. And these were shared with us from Rob Clavins at Oregon Wild from the Walla-Whitman National Forest. And then I do want to be fully clear and transparent that not all recent logging that we have field surveying is a virtual clear cut or includes logging of old and large trees. A lot of it doesn't. But that said, even when it doesn't, we still find widespread issues that we're extremely concerned about, and that includes things like soil damage, erosion, fine sediment delivering to streams, road-related damage, degradation or destruction of wildlife and wildlife habitats. And so we still remain very concerned even when it's not, some of that other logging that I showed you. And make no mistake, logging is happening on a very widespread basis in Eastern Oregon. And so I'm going to continue to pick on the Malheur National Forest for a minute. So this map was actually made by the Nature Conservancy for one of the collaborative groups on the Malheur. And both the crosshatch and the fully colored polygons shapes show logging projects. So this depicts that essentially the entirety of the Malheur National Forest, save just a little bit, is covered by a logging project. And so the only difference for these different, like the cross-hatching and the colors, are that some of these, at the time this map was made, had been recently signed decisions, so logging was already underway or had even been completed recently. Some of these were currently being proposed and some were up and coming. But and the malheur is not unique in increasing the pace and scale of logging and having these extensive logging projects, many of which run back to back. And actually, I also want to note that unfortunately, the Forest Service on the east side is increasingly going into ecologically sensitive areas, and that includes mature and old forest, streamside riparian corridors that are directly adjacent to streams that were supposed to be the buffers from logging, and moist mixed conifer forests, steep slope, and sometimes even roadless areas. And I also want to note that, one of the collateral damage aspects of this is carbon storage, as Chad discussed a bit. And so, for example, in Eastern Oregon, there was recent research by Dr. David Drexler and his colleagues showing that large trees make up only 3% of trees on the east side, which is a very small number compared to historic norms. And large trees are desperately needed by wildlife and are at a deficit across the landscape. And also that these 3% of trees that are large, over 21 inches, store the vast majority of the carbon, so 42% of the carbon, yet they're being targeted increasingly by the Forest Service with attempts at rollback of protections for large trees and things like that. So, and most of this is, again, under the guise of thinning to prevent or control wildfires. I also want to note that a lot of fuels reduction also targets wildlife habitat in particular. So fuels reduction, the fuels that are being targeted are the same habitats that wildlife sometimes depend on, depending on the species and the forest type. And so these fuels are the very habitat components that are needed by some species to survive. And that's especially true for species that are associated with or depend on mature and old forests, multi-layered canopies, denser forests, snags, and logs. So unfortunately, what I'm getting at here is that there's a lot of collateral damage that is largely downplayed or entirely ignored by timber industry, Forest Service, collaborative groups, and that results from this log it to save it from wildfire kind of strategy. And Eastern Oregon in particular has just amazing biodiversity. These pictures were all taken in proposed timber sales by BMBP staff and volunteers, mostly by Karen, who's in the audience somewhere. And as part of this, I would be remiss if I did not mention that part of this collateral damage is the result of timber sale infrastructure such as roads. And so timber sales rely on roads. They need lots and lots and lots of roads. And so again, I'm continuing to pick on the malheur since you've already seen the map here. This is a map of existing roads on the Malheur National Forest, and I pulled this data off the Malheur National Forest GIS library. And so the Malheur National Forest has over 3.5 miles per square mile on average of road. That actually jumps to over 4 miles per square mile if you take out roadless and wilderness areas. And so this kind of road density is well recognized, well documented to be detrimental to fish, to water quality, to wildlife habitats, and also it is in violation of their own forest plan standards. So both the Malheur, for example, and the Wallowa-Whitman National Forest each have over 9,000 miles of road. You can pretty much drive to each corner of the country and still not go as many miles as are encompassed in each of those national forests. And given the logging and road densities, it's not surprising that national forests in Eastern Oregon have a huge stream temperature problem. And so this is, you can see streams with water quality limited and impaired waters in Eastern Oregon, and it's a huge problem on federal public lands, and stream water temperature is the most widespread water quality impairment. So over 1,240 miles of stream on national forests in the Blue Mountains are listed as not meeting water quality criteria. And I know this is a little bit afield of the kind of direct wildfire issue, but for me, when I think about the collateral damage of all this logging and all these roads, one of the first place my mind jumps to and my heart jumps to is the damage being done to water quality, wildlife, fish, also drinking water. And so I think I might be at time. I guess real quick, I wanted to just mention that, in Eastern Oregon and other places, there are still large blocks of core habitats that are incredibly important for wildlife. Key connectivity corridors still exist. And I really want to see us protect these places and not lose this opportunity before they disappear. And especially in the age of climate change and biodiversity crises, this becomes ever more important, partly for allowing species to be able to adapt to climate change, to migrate, to continue to exist, or at least give them the best chance of continuing to exist. And so we really need a paradigm shift away from these false narratives. And you know, as Chad mentioned, most of the logging is proposed deep in the woods, far from homes and communities. And logging in the backcountry does not make homes or communities any safer. And really, really quick, I just wanted to kind of rip through these, kind of, you know, a little bit building on some of this narrative. So this is a timber sale unit that was in the Camp Lick sale. That is across the street, not a timber sale unit, old logging unit. You know, like these really important wildlife habitats, these mature and old forests are what are being targeted. So this is a timber sale unit that was proposed in the South George sale. This is in that same area, not a timber sale unit, but old logging. So it's like this checkerboard of these plantations that are often very dense, have been logged in the not too distant past, and are, you know, here you can see kind of the erosion coming down from the old clear cut. And unfortunately, they're targeting what's left in this, you know, sometimes checkerboard of these plantations. Here's what some of that logging looked like in that same timber sale that we surveyed. Similarly, this is a sale unit in the Malheur in the Austin sale, this beautiful mixed conifer forest. This is right next door to that sale unit, literally right next door. And so, you know, this is, they're going after the remaining wildlife habitat, the remaining carbon storage, and, you know, potentially going to make us, the emissions, climate change worse by all this logging, right? And so here's a little bit more. This is an old unit of sale near where they are going after the remaining mature and old forests. So, yeah, that's it. Thank you, everybody.
Hi, everybody. Wow, there's so many people here. Okay, hi, my name is Rita Von Frost. I'm a forest advocate with the Natural Resources Defense Council, also known as NRDC. Before I worked at NRDC, I started about 3 years ago. I'm actually a Southerner. I come from the southeastern United States, and I worked for an organization called Dogwood Alliance. So all in all, I've been working on industrial scale wood pellet manufacturing issues for 10 years now, which I am shortening to forest biomass, because that's a lot easier to say. I live and work on unceded Kalapuya land. I use she, her pronouns. My email's right here in case you want to follow up with me. I'm taking a little bit of a right turn away from fire that Chad and Paula set us up, but I am going to weave that thread through because industrial scale wood pellet manufacturing is being proposed in the Pacific Northwest and is coming under the guise of wildfire mitigation and forest resiliency. With all these increased projects for logging due to wildfire resilience, due to increased management of our forests because of wildfires, there's this huge question of what to do with all the material. Industrial scale wood pellet manufacturing has been established in the southeastern United States now for about 15 years due to renewable energy policies that were created in the European Union and the United Kingdom. This is a large amount of their renewable energy. It's a full 60% of what the European Union deems as renewable energy. They're burning wood pellets. So because of that, there are large markets for this material. However, it is not a climate solution. In fact, it's a false climate solution, which I will get into here. So I want to start with just calling it Forest Biomass 101. I mean, at the very ground level in this room, who has heard of like bioenergy, wood pellets, biomass? Okay, so there's a lot of educated folks in this room. That's great. I'm not going to get into it that much then because Alex and I have about 40 minutes and we want to save a lot of time for questions. So when I'm talking about forest biomass, one of the things I want to distinguish between Chad and I is that biomass itself as a term is pretty vague, right? It refers to any sort of living material or once living material. When I use that term, I'm purely talking about the energy application of it. In the United States, bioenergy has looked like a lot of A lot of small mills, honestly, in California right now, there are about 18 bioenergy facilities. At the height of bioenergy production in California, there were about 800 megawatts online. However, the international markets dwarf that. So one facility in the United Kingdom called Drax, which is a major climate villain, their capacity is 3,900 megawatts. So this one facility in the United Kingdom, where the majority of wood pellets are eventually sold to and where they're burned, is nearly 5 times all of the bioenergy that was ever online in California at one time. The industry in the southeastern United States was really predicated upon using wastes, leftovers, unmerchantable wood. What we found every time we went into the field was that they were making logging worse and they were increasing the reaches of logging. Furthermore, there was climate pollution at every step. Because they're taking material from the forest that otherwise would have been left behind, they are decreasing our carbon sink, and it is a waste of time and energy. This is just a brief depiction of the supply chain. So this was a cut that my supervisor Adam, Colette, and I went out to in 2015. We had to do a lot of watchdogging of this industry, differently than the Pacific Northwest. Most of the forests in the southeastern United States are privately owned. 90% of them are privately owned. So we were at a disadvantage in that we had to figure out where the cuts were. We usually would go up overhead in planes. We would go up in little biplanes, figure out where the logging equipment was, and then follow it up on the ground to then determine where that material was going. We wanted to determine if the wood pellet biomass industry was actually truly using waste, residues, leftovers, right? We wanted to see what they were doing. We saw all these trees going in on trucks to the facilities. Like, it's easy to, wait outside of a facility, but we also wanted to see what it was like on the ground. Unfortunately, when the wood pellet biomass industry set up shop, all of a sudden we saw a lot more encroachment into wetlands, bottomland hardwood forests, really precious forests that had kind of been not touched by the traditional forest products industry, but with biomass, they could take anything because they end up drying it, pulverizing it, turning it into wood pellets. They also were taking a lot of trees, right? Just straight up full trees. And that's one of those myths that I want to dispel. Wood pellet biomass in the southern United States has actually caused deforestation in some areas. There's an area 4 mills on the North Carolina-Virginia line, and there's now been deforestation linked to that. The proposals that are in the Pacific Northwest right now, there's 2 up in Washington, there are 2 in California. The facilities that are proposed in California would by far and away be some of the, it would be one of the largest wood products players in California right now. I think that Gary Hughes is in the room. He might be able to fact check me on that. But as far as what the wood products industry looks like in California right now and in Washington, this industry is going to massively increase the amount of forests that are taken on these lands. Oh, and I didn't even get through. Okay, so they're then taken to the wood pellets manufacturing facility, which is that picture up there, and I'll show you all another one. After the wood pellets are made, they have to be sent to the port on either truck or trains. This is really concerning to communities that are already dealing with the impacts of too much transportation already going in and out of their communities. They are then stored at ports where they can spontaneously combust and turn into fires. In my home state of Texas, at the Port Arthur export terminal, there was a fire that burned for 102 days. When they were moving the pellet piles around to try to put the flames out, which is the only way that you can put pellet fires out, a stack of those pellets actually fell onto a worker and killed him. It also sent multiple people in those neighborhoods surrounding the port to the hospital based off of the amount of smoke that was billowing into their community for over 100 days. And then finally, they're sent to a power station like this, such as Drax, which I've already spoken about a little bit. So one of the things that I want to underscore here is, as ever, right, let's listen to the scientists. So wood pellet biomass in the southeastern United States, as well as up in the Pacific Northwest, gets these shrouds around logging, right? They're going to take waste, leftovers, residues. In the Pacific Northwest, hey, we're going to be a wildfire mitigation and forest resiliency strategy. In the countries that are importing them, such as the European Union and the United Kingdom, Japan, South Korea, it's called renewable energy. So the only reason this industry exists is because it's called renewable energy. It's subsidized on par with solar and wind. The industry has received over $50 billion in subsidies from 2015 to 2021. But it is not carbon neutral, nor is it renewable. This is taking a definition from sustainable forestry and sustainable logging, the idea that trees grow back, and applying it to the energy sector. Unfortunately, scientists have really dispelled the notion that it's carbon neutral, and it's definitely not going to have any sort of carbon paybacks in the time period that we need in order to address climate change. So our partners at the Partnership for Policy Integrity, in this graph up here, they were able to show at the smokestack, burning biomass is more carbon emissive than any fossil fuel. So that dispelled that notion. And then furthermore, at NRDC, we wanted to see what the whole life cycle emissions were, the life cycle analysis of wood pellet biomass. So we agreed with PFPI's analysis, but we wanted to see what does it look like from forest all the way to the smokestack, right, which is the most emissive part of the process. And we were able to show that the upstream emissions alone are more carbon emissive than the average emissions for the US electrical grid. So just the upstream emissions for logging that forest, putting it on a truck, taking to a facility, turning into a wood pellet, that is more emissive than what we're okay with here on average for our own US electrical grid, let alone the stack emissions. So this underscores a letter, some verbiage that went into a letter from scientists to the European Union. 800 scientists signed it, including IPCC authors, the US Medal of Science winner, as well as many other acclaimed scientists, who said using wood deliberately harvested for burning will increase carbon in the atmosphere and warming for decades to centuries. So we thoroughly debunked the claim that this is any sort of carbon benefit, right? But furthermore, let's get into this waste, residues, and unmerchantable trees bit for a little bit. Because we are losing precious forests to this industry. And it's really important to think about how this industry is going to impact the carbon sink that we have right now, as well as what it will do to the biodiversity that lives there and is also dependent on those forests. We're not only facing a climate change crisis, we're also facing a biodiversity crisis, and biodiversity relies on intact ecosystems. So I just want to run through some of the worst pictures that I was able to capture while I was at Dogwood Alliance, so y'all can see this. It's happened every single year that we've gone out into the field. Unfortunately, one of the things that I wanted to spell too is that piles are still being left behind, so it's not displacing any sort of pile burning. I know that pile burning is an issue for many communities in Oregon, Washington, California, BC, right? It's not displacing the piles. The reason why the piles don't work is that material is actually too small, it's too fine to be turned into a wood pellet. Wood pellet burners on the other side of the ocean have very high international standards when it comes to the amount of other material that can be in that wood pellet. What's the easiest thing to do is to take a whole tree, debark it, and then turn it into a wood pellet, right? So they're not going to go through the motions of actually doing some work that many communities need, which is displacing wood piles. This was a over 100 acre clear cut of a over 100 plus year forest in Virginia. 2018, 2017. Oh, I wanted to show you all this picture because this is overhead at a wood pellet manufacturing facility in Sampson County. That's in North Carolina. Just to give you a point of the scale, like check out those 18-wheelers that are lined up, bringing in the material. So those look tiny compared to the rest of this facility. This facility is actually smaller than one of them that is proposed in California in Lassen County. And then it would be on par with the facilities that are proposed in Washington. 2016, again. As I said earlier, this is a total waste of resources, both for renewable energy needs. We've been able to do studies that show that for those energy markets that are importing wood pellets, they actually can meet their renewable energy needs reliably with other sources that are not wood pellets. And then furthermore, as Chad and Paula really spelled out, these projects that are leading to this material that's left behind, we don't need that for wildfire mitigation or forest resiliency either. So on both sides, whether they're getting the subsidies from the energy side of things or they're getting some of the grants from the US Forest Service, for instance, for some of this wildfire mitigation work, we think that this is a waste of our time and energy. And I think that Paula and Chad really spelled this out. So, for us, we want to bring in the wildfire mitigation and forest resiliency arguments, but for the sake of time, for Alex, I'm going to move us ahead. And thank you all so much.
Okay, I'm going to try and go fast and make sure we have some time for questions. I'm going to talk briefly about carbon offsets, and specifically forest carbon offsets. There are many different kinds of offsets, and just going to be talking about the forest carbon offset piece of things. How many folks have heard of forest carbon offsets before? Okay, great. Well, that's probably because the market has grown tremendously over the last decade or so. Just as one point of reference, in 2016, there was less than $70 million spent on forest and land use carbon offsets. By 2021, that was $1.3 billion. So a tremendous increase in that market over the last 10 years, which is, it's mostly been, we're seeing it more now here in our region. The basics of how carbon offsets work, the idea, at least, is that trees absorb carbon and store it in the soil, in their biomass, and their leaves and their bark and everything. And then the landowner for those trees gets paid by a big polluter to not cut down the trees that they would have cut otherwise. And so then the big polluter can say, we're carbon neutral, even though we are burning coal, because we paid this other person not to cut down their forest, and so they're offsetting our carbon emissions. That's the theory, or the idea. But it doesn't actually work, it turns out. There are four kind of core reasons why: additionality, leakage, durability, and perverse incentives. Additionality is the idea that was it something that was going to happen anyways. So if I own 1,000 acres of forest and I wasn't planning to log it, but I sell carbon offsets for it, those trees were going to stay standing anyways. So there's not actually an offset there. There's no, it's not additional carbon sequestration to what would have happened without the money from those offset credits. There's also leakage. This is kind of a theme. Ecologies are super complex and they don't fit in accounting ledgers and spreadsheets in the way that we sometimes wish they would. Things like disease, outbreaks, and insects, fire, all mean that ecosystems are not static. It's not you don't sell an offset and then the forest just stays like that and we don't have to worry about anything changing. We know ecosystems are constantly in flux and shift, and that makes trying to sell offsets for them and account for the carbon in a really detailed way very challenging, next to impossible. Durability, how long will it last? If I put a forest into an offset category for 50 years, but then someone else buys the land from me 50 years from now and they log it, then that carbon has just been released. And it's happening a little bit later than it would have otherwise, but how durable are these things? And then perverse incentives. Everyone is making so much money in this market that everyone has an incentive to inflate the prices, to over-credit. There's another problem where carbon offset brokers claim that they're sequestering more carbon than is actually happening on the ground, and that kind of verification is really hard. And there's actually been a big scandal over the last couple of years with some of the largest carbon offset brokers in the world, one called South Pole and one called Vera. And South Pole in particular was systemically over-crediting the credits that they were selling and the offsets that they were selling. And they have a financial incentive to do so. They make more money if they can claim that they're sequestering more carbon, and there's no one to verify that. So those are the four core problems. And kind of digging into some more specific examples of that, in the US, California is kind of at the forefront of this with their offset program that's run through the California Air Resources Board. This is a study by Dr. Barbara Haya and others. Dr. Barbara Haya is kind of like one of the leading lights of research into carbon offset programs and has been studying them since the Kyoto Protocol back in the 90s. And she does a lot of great work at UC Berkeley and has more impressive studies than I could fit into this presentation. But this was a study from, I think, 2023 that found that forests in California that were under offset designation were not being logged or disturbed any less than forests that were not under offset designation. So that's that additionality thing, there's not actually a change happening there because these forests are under offset designations. Money is changing hands and people get to claim that they're carbon neutral, but nothing actually on the ground is changing. And then here was another one. This was a different study using, I think, LiDAR and satellite data, looking at the California program. And they found similarly that the claims of carbon sequestration that were being made were not what was actually going on. There were issues with additionality, so a lot of the forests that were under their offset designation weren't realistically going to be cut anyways in that time frame. So there's no additional carbon storage or sequestration happening through that. And that many lands that were under offset designation still had high harvest rates. They were still being cut. It wasn't significantly reducing that. And we know, I guess I should have thrown something in there at the beginning. Does anyone know what the largest source of carbon warming emissions in the state of Oregon is? By sector?
Logging.
Wow. Great. You all have been listening to a bunch of presentations. I'm glad that we're getting out now. And so most of the carbon in forests, or plurality, is stored in the soil, not actually in tree trunks. And that is also released even after when forests are cut. It's not just the wood that's being taken out and the residuals that are left rotting on the ground, decomposing and releasing that carbon into the atmosphere, like Slash and some of the pictures that, they were in all of your pictures actually. I'm not going to go through each of these things individually. There's another issue, durability. This is an example of that. So in California, when someone buys an offset or puts land into an offset designation, they have to put a part of that doesn't count towards the offset that they can sell. Basically, there's an insurance pool. There's a recognition that, there are fires that happen, insects and diseases, other things can happen that release more of the carbon in the forests. So we're gonna, create a buffer pool of extra forests that are part of the offset program, but are not being sold as offsets, to cover any of those carbon losses and leakage from things like fire and disease. This study, I think it was just 2 years ago, the year's not on there. I think this was 2022, found that wildfires had rapidly depleted 1/5 of the total. Basically, the insurance pool was burning up. It feels to me very analogous to what's going on what's been in the news lately with the California home insurance market, and that it's a system that was designed for a climate that we no longer live in. And that's similar with the buffer pool in California. It was designed with an expectation of stability that is no longer realistic. Speaking about perverse incentives, I mentioned these two companies before. These are quotes from, or the kind of headline pages from a Guardian investigation into Vera, which was the world's largest carbon offset verifier, and that 90% of the rainforest carbon offsets they were selling were worthless. And then there was also a big expose in the New Yorker about this company, South Pole. These are both mainly operating in the tropics and the global south. That's predominantly where the carbon offsets industry has been located, although we're definitely seeing more of that come in to this region as well, mainly through the California program, but there are forests in Oregon and Washington that are also under offset designation as part of the California program. They don't have to be in California to be offsets within the California program. More than that, increasingly we're seeing colonial land grabs, and that's one of the effects that carbon offset programs are having. So this was, I think this was November 2023, a company, the Kenyan government evicted the Okige people off their lands in Kenya at the behest of a company called Blue Carbon to seize their lands for carbon offsets. Just to be really illustrative about it, Blue Carbon is a UAE company, and it's where some of the money from UAE oil and gas drilling is going to then be able to brand, that's how they meet net zero goals, is we take the money that we made from oil and gas and buy carbon offsets, and now we're net zero and green. And there's a real continuity there. That's the primary beneficiaries, the primary participants in the offset market. The buyers of credits are predominantly oil and gas companies. It's the fossil fuel industry. There was like a moment in the last few years when a bunch of big tech companies were also moving into the sector and buying up a lot of credits and looking to buy more. They've as with a bunch of other things, have backpedaled significantly from that. They no longer feel that there's political pressure on them to even make the appearance, they don't even need to greenwash themselves anymore. But sectors like that are just hard to decarbonize, whether that's the fossil fuel industry because it's just a fundamentally carbon emitting industry, or things like the tech industry where decarbonizing their supply chains is very challenging. So what do offsets actually do? Like we said, primarily they serve as greenwashing. They enable big polluters to keep on polluting, but to label themselves as being green, being part of the solution, contributing to climate action. They also, similar to some of the things that Paul and Chad and Rita talked about, suck up resources that could be going to other projects that could make a real difference and that could more effectively mitigate the impacts of climate change. The financial incentives, again, it's rich people trading money mostly with other rich people. That was part of the scandal with South Pole, was that part of their claim was if you buy offsets from us, we give the money to the local community that we work with, and so it's like an economic development thing. But that money wasn't actually going to those folks. They weren't getting the money. South Pole was keeping it all and buying, private jets and things. It's rich people trading money with other rich people. It's a way to keep that money in that class. Land grabs, like I mentioned, it's not just in Kenya. We've seen that all around the global south, where the industry has moved in. And then here in the Northwest, it is more the timber industry is the ones that are selling these. They generally only, the president of AFRC, the American Forest Resources Council, has said that they don't support offsets unless they just get to sell offsets for the 2x4s that they're already making. So we only are interested in that if it's going to give us a new revenue stream, but we're not interested if it means we have to change any of the ways we're managing our forests. And if we have to change, if it would stop us from being the largest source of climate pollution in the state of Oregon. Like I said, forests are just more complex than accounting ledgers. And the whole premise of carbon offsets is we can take the complexity of the world and the carbon cycle and ecologies and fit it into a spreadsheet, into columns that we can add up and subtract and balance. And that's just not how it actually works. I think this gets to a bigger question of how do we define the problem of climate change, which applies also to wildfire and community safety, and how we choose to define problems points us in very different directions in terms of what we consider to be solutions. So is climate change just a problem of atmospheric carbon concentration? And if tomorrow the IPCC held a press conference that said, this is really embarrassing, but we got our sums wrong, turns out we're fine. We can pump as much carbon in the atmosphere as we want. It doesn't mean everything would be okay. We would still be, crashing biodiversity. There would still be all the justice implications, or injustices rather, that are baked in to the current global polluting economy. So how do we define the problem, or is this an issue of the exploitative relationship modern human society has with the rest of the living world? And that kind of hubris of we can commodify and fit everything into a spreadsheet, and that we can control and manage, and nature is not going to move or change on its own. It will do what we expect it to do. Just increasingly in the age of climate change is not viable anymore. And one example of this, Finland has reduced their carbon emissions, their output, by about 40% relative to, I can't remember if it's 1995 or 1990 or 2005 levels. But it's been entirely canceled out because their forests don't absorb as much carbon. The reduction in the amount of carbon that their forests have been able to absorb and store has completely offset all the gains that they've had in reducing point source emissions. So bottom line, forest ecosystems can and do store tremendous amounts of carbon, and protecting them is a critical part of climate mitigation. But treating that like an accounting ledger that we can manage and control isn't going to work in the age of climate crisis in the same way that the home insurance marketplace that we've had for the last 50, 100 years is no longer going to work. The world in which we are existing is changing, and we need to change with it. And so when we turn complex ecosystems into markets, that logic of profit grabs the steering wheel. And that's always going to take us down the road of what increases investor returns and capital holdings, rather than what effectively mitigates climate change or, is beneficial for communities and forests. I think, yeah, that's it. Okay, so we have 12 minutes for questions. Carol?
Yeah, I have a question for Chad and Paula about forest density. Because Chad was talking about biomass, like amount of biomass in older forests as being dense forests, but then you showed a photo, Paula, of a dense plantation. So, I don't know, can either of you talk about the difference there? And would there be other terms that you would use in each case?
You want to take that one, Chad?
You go first. Yeah, good question. So I'm talking about carbon density, really, but you can also talk about in terms of tree density. So there's been a lot of research about young tree plantations. They do tend to burn more intensely than mature forests, for example. And higher tree mortality typically. But at the same time, they're mostly low and moderate intensity burns, even in young tree plantations. So like one study looked at it and found that tree plantations had 16% high severity and the surrounding mature forest had 12% high severity. So it was a significant difference, but it wasn't a huge difference. So they do tend to burn more intensely, but generally it's still mostly driven by weather and climate factors in terms of how the fires burn. So it's not like these factors are unimportant, they just aren't the main drivers. But if you're just looking at mature forests, a very open, low-density mature forest versus a very high-density mature forest, a lot of carbon, higher tree density, that's the denser forest is typically going to have a microclimate that's going to be less conducive to intense fire overall.
And this might be obvious, but I just want to also note, because I was talking about that in the context of wildlife, and so when you talk about dense, homogeneous tree plantations of often monocrop species, that does not provide at all the same wildlife habitat as a multi-story forest canopy that has what I like to call critter condos, snags, little nooks and crannies for wildlife to live, and the kind of heterogeneity that a lot of species depend upon.
Yeah.
I'm curious, also for these ideas of thinning and fuel density, if there's not necessarily a correlation between fuel density and fire intensity, and if actually fuel density might reduce fuel's availability and reduce intensity, how do you make sense of what I think now is sort of a common sense idea that fire exclusion and full suppression policies have contributed to current wildfire severity through fuels accumulation? Are there other sorts of accumulation going on? Is the idea that climate is actually sort of an overriding factor there and is more to blame? Like, how do you make sense of that relationship between fire exclusion, fuels, and fire severity?
Yeah, so the idea that forests that haven't burned in a long time are going to burn much more intensely is so intuitively obvious. It's so obviously true that no one bothered to actually gather data on it, to investigate it for decades. It was just stated again and again and again. So a colleague of mine and I, we were the first ones to ever even do a study on this in the Sierra Nevada. We published that in 2006. And we found that the forests that hadn't burned in the longest time, when they burned, they had slightly lower severity than the forests that had burned more recently. Now again, if it burned like 5 years earlier, it is going to make a difference, but there isn't like this linear increase. So the really long unburned forests, they were burning at mostly low and moderate intensity, and they actually had slightly lower levels of high intensity. Others said, that's ridiculous. There's no way that's true. You guys must have screwed up somehow. So they did their studies. They found the same thing. Others said, you guys were all screwed up. You must have messed up. They did their own study. They found the same thing. And so what you find, if you look at the scientific literature, the vast majority of the studies find some version of that, either lower severity in the really long unburned forest or about the same. We found it's about the same, slightly lower. So it really comes down to this microclimate thing. But the problem is that this is really a marketing issue. It was never something that was well established scientifically. It was a bunch of prominent people in the mid-20th century that got together and said, this is obviously true, didn't test it scientifically, and then kept saying it's true. And then other people decided to say it's true, and then the media started repeating it. Everyone's been repeating it for generations. And yet, on the other hand, overwhelmingly, when people look at it, we find it's not true. And so, what I guess going to your point that climate is the overriding factor, it's absolutely the overriding factor. It's always been the overriding factor. It's even more of an overriding factor now in the era of climate change. And so I guess that's the point, is that if anything, these denser mature forests are acting as a climate buffer against the extreme weather driven by climate change, especially during fires.
Yeah, this is also a question for Chad. You briefly mentioned FOFA, the Fix Our Forests Act, and how certain voices are preying on the devastation in Los Angeles to advance bills that aren't really going to fix our forests. But I'm wondering if you can suspend the reality of Congress right now, and what would your Fix Our Forests Act include?
That's great. That's a great question, and my co-panelists might have thoughts on that too. But I'll just briefly say this: is that we're not going to fix our forests through industrial resource extraction, biomass logging for saw timber. That's not going to improve forest health, especially in the era of the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis. We need to keep the carbon in our forests. We need to shift our focus and resources to home hardening, defensible space pruning, and evacuation planning and assistance to keep communities safe. The vast majority of wildfire funding right now, wildfire planning, wildfire funding of any type, is going into backcountry logging. It's not going into community safety. So I guess what I would say is this, is that fire is a natural part of our forest ecosystems. In the eastern US and the western US, different forest types have different fire regimes. Fire is a natural part of all these systems. And the overwhelming majority of our forests have less fire now than they used to. Before colonization, Native American cultural burning, lightning strikes, there was significantly more fire. And because of modern industrial policies, the cultural burning has been suppressed, lightning strikes and fires from that has been suppressed. They were both more common historically. I think they should both be more common in the future, and we should remove administrative barriers that are suppressing both. So I would say more managed wildfire, more Native American cultural burning. In some cases, prescribed burning, although that's been abused in lots of places, but it's not always the wrong move. But more burning in general. And the good news here is that you don't have to remove trees before you do burning, because again, it's not about forest density, it's about the weather. You just don't start a fire if you want low intensity fire. You don't start a fire in a drought year on a hot, dry, windy day. You start it in the early part of fire season when the weather is mild. And there's lots of research on that, backing that point up. You can go on the John Muir Project's website. You can follow up with me by email. I'll send you information on that. But I think the answer is more burning in the backcountry, and which is a lot cheaper, and it's also good for lots of different communities, plant, animal, and human, for lots of different reasons. And then redirect our current funding from the wasteful current approach, which is backcountry logging, into actually saving homes and lives in communities, especially the lower income communities where they don't have the financial resources right now to protect themselves.
I have a question. Wouldn't prescribe, in that, following that train of logic, if that thing, since it removes the wind barrier, like increases kind of the spread of fire, or doesn't slow, but in fact speeds up the spread of fire, wouldn't prescribed burning have the same issue of it opening up space?
Most prescribed burning is low intensity surface fire, so it kills some seedlings and saplings. It consumes duff and litter on the forest floor, twigs and pine needles and dry leaves, but it doesn't tend to change the forest canopy structure more. Now, of course, there are some mixed intensity prescribed fires out there. That does happen sometimes, but overwhelmingly it's low intensity surface fire. So it certainly doesn't have the same effect on the forest canopy that the typical commercial thinning project has, that's for sure.
This is a question for you, Rita. I'm in California. I'm kind of paying attention to what's happening in Stockton and with the low carbon fuel standard relatedly. And I'm wondering if the projects you're seeing have any kind of regulatory footholds that support them in the United States outside of the kind of international trade that's also, or international subsidies that are popping up the
Is the question if there's regulatory footholds for the industry aside from the subsidies?
footholds or support, or what's happening in the Southeast that maybe I'm not seeing?
Yeah, you know, I mean, I think a lot of the support is just business as usual, right? It's really hard to get a moratorium on this industry, but what you're pointing out is that we have a lot of local jurisdictional power to push back against the wood pellet biomass industry, and that we can intervene at a lot of different levels. The California and Washington and Oregon are very different from the Southeast in that they have better environmental protection laws. The Southeastern United States has nothing like SEPA, like they do up in Washington, or CEQA, like we do down in California. So we get to intervene in a couple different places. Right now, we're at that environmental planning phase with CEQA. We also have the opportunity to intervene with the Port of Stockton Commissioners, the Lassen County Board of Supervisors, the Tuolumne County Board of Supervisors, and I think each of those places kind of gives us an opportunity to take multiple bites of the apple and stop the project that way. We don't really see any sort of like huge domestic wood pellet biomass burning sector, so if we can stop it at the Port of Stockton, or if we can stop the production, then we may be able to just stop them altogether from ever getting a foothold in California.
Actually, I want to apologize. I think I misstated the question. I was thinking about regulatory support. So
Okay.
the low carbon fuel standard is actually supporting things like biofuels.
Yeah.
I'm unfamiliar with pellets in California. I think this is a new kind of idea for me at least. I'm not here here, but I was just wondering if you were seeing like programs that might have full solution type, financial support or subsidies.
For sure. I mean, the reason why the wood pellet manufacturing industry is targeting California and Washington is also because the policies have kind of set the stage for them to stick a shoe in, right? There already is existing bioenergy. That's a huge thing. And then there are wildfire mitigation goals. California has a goal of clearing 1 million acres of forests as a wildfire mitigation strategy, right? And so then they're left with the question of what do we do with that? I think that sets the scene for a player like the wood pellet manufacturing industry to say, hey, look at us, we can do something with this product, right? That's where I think the intersection is, even if the state has not gone so far to say we, California, support wood pellet manufacturing, right? That has not been something that is on the books. They support bioenergy, they support biochar, they support hydrogen. All those things could be created out of wood pellets. They have not gone so far to say that they support wood pellets. That's also a thing that we want to get them on record saying. For instance, the state of North Carolina, now that they've seen all this destructive wood pellet manufacturing, have said in their own climate plans that we do not ever see a future where we will burn wood pellets. That's about the best that we could hope for. But that still gives us that opportunity in the state of California to see something regulatory-wise.
Yeah, I was just wondering if there's an analysis out there that breaks down what's really happening with the Fix Our Forest Act.
Yeah, I think
There is. Where is it?
Yeah, we have that on the John Muir Project's website, and you can also reach out to me or to Jen, and they can get you information. We've got breakdowns of the Fix Our Forest Act and where it's at. Right now, the fight is in the Senate, and so the goal is to stop the Senate from taking it up or passing it right now. The House passed it, but the Senate has not.
Yeah, 'cause I'm being told, like, it already passed the House, don't worry about it, and I'm like, no.
Yeah, whoever's telling you that, ignore them. We gotta fight it in the Senate.
All right.